The heavy summer sun beat down on the dusty streets of San Antonio, making everything shimmer just a little as the city settled into the slow hum of morning. Inside the courthouse, the hard wooden benches were already filling up, people shifting in their seats as if preparing for just another day. But the tension in the air told a different story, one that everyone seemed to know, but no one wanted to talk about. The old fans overhead moved sluggishly, barely stirring the thick air, while the flags at the front drooped in the heat. When Samuel Rodriguez walked through those doors, he held his faded cap in both hands, his gaze calm and steady. It was the kind of quiet look that came with years of living and working under the Texas sun, a face that had seen plenty and maybe more than its share. There was something almost old-fashioned in the way Samuel entered, shoulders square, each step placing him against the wooden floor that had known who knows how many stories before his. As he made his way down the aisle toward the defendant's table, the crowd's eyes followed him. People whispered, nudged one another, and some just stared. Even before the judge said a word, the whole room seemed to have settled on an outcome. Maybe it was the way Samuel looked, his weathered skin, hair going grey, or just the fact that he belonged to a generation and a community that, for decades, had gotten used to their voices being drowned out. Each glance from the wooden benches to the rows of attorneys seemed to confirm, without anyone daring to say it out loud, that they all expected things to go as they always had. Samuel felt the worn boards under his boots, each creak reminding him of the quiet strength of those who came before. He remembered his mother telling him, when he was barely tall enough to help in the fields, that some days it was enough just to stand with your back straight. Now, inside that high-ceilinged room, he carried with him the stories and the hopes of those who could not speak for themselves. When his eyes finally met the judge's, Samuel didn't flinch. Even though every whisper and every sideways glance seemed to say there was no place for justice here, he held onto the small storm of hope inside, a hope forged from years of dignity, sweat, and the strength to keep going, no matter how many times the odds were stacked against him. Samuel sat alone at the defendant's table, his hands resting quietly in his lap. He wore his best shirt, pressed as neatly as he could manage, though the collar chafed a little at his neck. There was no lawyer sitting beside him, no one to lean in and whisper advice or objections when the gavel came down. Even the seat next, to him, looked too empty, like it should have belonged to someone who could explain all the complicated words and strange customs of the court. But Samuel knew, deep down, that no fancy legal talk would ever have truly spoken for him. His only weapon that morning was the truth. That truth was stubborn, still there after everything, and it had taken a fair number of bruises along the way. Over the years, Samuel had seen how easily the world could twist a story, how rumors could grow roots and take hold, but he also knew what had really happened. The truth was a quiet thing, not always easy to notice in a place like this, but it was all he had, and he held on to it with the same determination that got him through long, hot days, picking pecans year after year. As the judge and the clerks shuffled papers across their tables, Samuel became aware of the low hum of voices around him, a low, sticky kind of sound like bees around an open soda can. It was a mix of curiosity and judgment, like the whole room expected things to go a certain way, expected Samuel to fold under the pressure, to admit something just to make the process smoother for everyone else. It was almost like no one could. Imagine a man walking in without a lawyer and standing his ground was anything but foolish. Despite all this, Samuel kept his head up. He stared straight ahead, refusing to let the stares and murmurs chip away at what little sense of pride he had left. He knew the outcome might already be decided, that people in San Antonio had a way of keeping things the same generation after generation. He could feel it in the way people looked at him, not so much with active hatred, but with a tired certainty, like they had already set their minds and there was nothing he could say to change them. But for Samuel, this was bigger than the small matter on the docket. It was about belonging. The way the spectators looked at him made it clear. His very presence, his quiet insistence on being there and being seen, felt to them like a challenge to the way things had always been. Even before a word was spoken, the whole city's unspoken rules pressed down, heavy as the Texas sun outside. Samuel breathed in just once and kept his chin up. He was not planning on surrendering, not now, not ever. The moment Judge Wallace's voice cut through the stale air, it was like something clicked shut. 30 days, he said, barely pausing as if he'd said it 1,000 times before, and maybe he had. For Samuel, those 2 words weren't a shock, just another burden added to all the others he'd been quietly shouldering for years. The sentence was like another stone tossed onto a pile he carried around with him wherever he went. In that instant, some folks in the room just looked down, tapping their phones or shuffling papers, already moving on to whatever came next, as if 30 days in county was nothing, particularly for a man like Samuel, whose story probably sounded all too familiar by now. But Samuel did not falter, not even for a second. Straight after the verdict, he asked if he could make a phone call. The request sounded out of place in the stiff routine of the court, almost gentle, as if he was just being polite. But it weighed down the silence that followed. Some of the deputies hesitated, not used to a request like that coming from someone who'd just been sentenced, but Judge Wallace nodded almost imperceptibly, and someone brought over the phone. Holding the cold plastic receiver, Samuel felt the chill run up his arm. His mind flickered back to every other time he'd dialed a number with important news, births, deaths, warnings sent up and down the family tree. But this time his voice was little more than a whisper. Maybe only he and whoever would answer on the other side could have made out the words. "It's time, bring them," he said, quiet and steady. Just those few words. At first, no one moved. The courtroom, for a split second, felt unsettled and expectant. All the practiced routine put on hold. People looked at each other, eyebrows raised or heads tilted, wondering who Samuel could possibly be calling for and what exactly those words meant. All morning, things had played out exactly as everyone thought they would. Until now. That simple. Phone call, the way Samuel had said it, cut through the boredom of the system like a sudden crack in old plaster. Power, monotony, the same old scripts. They all felt a little less fixed for the first time in a long while, as if something nobody expected had just stepped out into the middle of the room. As Samuel stood there, the receiver slipping from his hand and a strange silence hanging in the air, the atmosphere inside that courthouse changed. The sticky heat clung to everyone, making people fan themselves with pieces of paper or dab their foreheads, but no one spoke. The silence felt almost solid, like you could lean on it or be pushed over by it. Whatever folks had expected from Samuel, they were starting to wonder if they had missed something. Every pair of eyes flicked from Samuel to the double doors at the back of the room, as if everyone shared the same nervous thought. The guards shifted, pretending to busy themselves, but really just watching with the rest. For a long moment, nothing happened, and the tension felt like it might stretch on forever. Then, with a heavy crash that cut through the haze, the doors swung open. In walked Elena Rodriguez, Samuel's daughter. She did not hurry, nor did she look around for approval. Instead, she simply walked forward with her chin held high. Her entrance caught everyone by surprise. Around San Antonio, people had heard things about Elena, how she had put herself through college, how she worked tirelessly at the community center on the west side, how she never let anyone tell her what she or her family could or could not do. Her hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and her steps were firm and unhesitant. To some, Elena was just another young woman from the South Side. To others, she was so much more, a symbol of a different future, and a challenge to the dusty rules of the old ways. Her presence was not meant to be loud, but it was impossible to ignore. Even the people who did not want to see her had to admit that something in the room shifted as soon as she stepped in. As she made her way to the front, passing rows of townsfolk who had rarely spoken to her except in passing, nobody quite knew how to react. For every judge and officer used to doing things by the book, her calm, almost defiant walk upset the balance. Elena was not just a visitor, nor only the daughter of a man in trouble. She brought with her the hopes and expectations of so many who never had a real voice in San Antonio's decisions, and for a moment it was as if the heavy old air was suddenly cleared out by something fresh and undeniable. Elena did not come, alone. As she entered the courthouse, right behind her walked a handful of people whose very presence seemed to change the mood in the room even more. 2 officers of the law, known in the San Antonio community for their honesty, flanked Elena. Beside them strode a pair of lawyers from the American Civil Rights Defense Council, their navy jackets crisp, their arms full of binders and folders bearing the organization's seal. They looked like people who knew their way through thick rule books and weren't afraid of a hard fight in any courthouse from Austin to Houston. The sound of their shoes hitting the old courthouse floor was steady, firm, and in rhythm, almost like a warning, but also a promise. Every footstep echoed off the faded tiles and deep wood panels, filling up the high ceiling above. Conversations around the room died out completely. To the folks watching, it was hard to tell if this sudden parade meant trouble for Samuel or rescue. To some, it felt almost like a storm cloud rolling in, but to others, it was as if they'd finally caught a hint of rain after a long drought. Elena walked with quiet purpose, her gaze steady and a little distant, as if she had already planned out every move before stepping into the building. She clutched a thick folder to her chest. The folder looked heavy, not just because of the paper packed inside, but because it held more than written words. The stories inside those pages went back farther than any present judge, beyond even the courthouse's earliest days. Documents, photographs, testimony from neighbors, an entire record of what her family and their community had weathered and what they had quietly accomplished despite it all. As Elena and her group made their way to the front, everyone in the room leaned just slightly forward. Was this the moment something would finally give? For years, the courthouse had felt like a stone fortress, unquestionable, unmoved by the worries of the folks it judged. But now, the very system seemed for a second to draw a breath and wonder. The hope and fear tangled together, caught in a single instant as Elena and her group stood, ready to test just how firm those old walls really were. From Judge Wallace to the last person in the back row, everyone waited, hearts pounding, not sure whether the day would end in the same way it began. As the energy in the courthouse grew more charged, Elena stepped up to the bench, her voice strong but steady as she addressed Judge Wallace directly. All eyes followed her, though she hardly glanced at the onlookers. "Your Honor," she began, "we are submitting new evidence regarding Mr. Rodriguez's ownership of the land in question." She spoke plainly. No grandstanding, no dramatic pauses. Instead, she opened her folder and started laying out page after page onto the judge's desk. One by one, she presented tax receipts, dating back 3 decades, maps with Samuel's name signed in familiar penmanship, and statements from neighbors who had known the Rodriguez family since before the interstate sliced through the old pecan groves. There was nothing flashy about the evidence, but it was all there, arranged in careful order. Each page seemed to settle on the table with quiet weight, the kind of force that comes from truth that has been ignored for too long. Elena guided the judge through property transfer forms, with matching signatures, land surveys, and even an old sepia photograph of Samuel with his parents in front of the painted clapboard house at the center of it all. The court clerk leaned in to see each sheet as Elena spoke, and for a moment the only sound was the soft rustling of paper sliding across polished wood. It was as if the whole courtroom paused, caught between what they had always assumed and what was being laid out right there in front of them, fine print and all. Some people held their breath, others exchanged nervous glances, unsure where this new information might lead. For Samuel, sitting just a few feet away, the moment was almost unreal. With every official document, it felt like a tiny piece of himself was being returned, something he had missed so badly he hardly remembered the pain. The years when his voice had gone unheard were suddenly, if briefly, balanced by facts no one could easily sweep aside. Around the room, a feeling grew, a mix of hope for justice and embarrassment that it had taken so long for these facts to get their moment. Even Judge Wallace, who had looked so certain before, now studied the documents closely, tapping one or two with his finger, as though the world had shifted while nobody was looking. In that courtroom, time didn't so much stop as hold its breath, waiting for whatever might come next. Judge Wallace straightened up, his jaw tightening as he drew himself deeper into the old carved chair. He began to speak, slowly at first, picking each word like a chess move, confident in the rules he had always known to be on his side. "The documents may be thorough, Ms. Rodriguez," he said, "but there are procedures that must be followed. County statutes demand filing within certain time frames. The code is clear about what evidence is considered timely." Every word came out measured, not angry, but unmistakably defensive, as if traditions themselves had sat down in the next chair over. He started flipping through papers, every so often pulling one out and quoting lines of legalese that, for years in this courthouse, might have seemed to end any conversation before it was truly begun. After all, the system here was built up over decades, sometimes centuries, so that certain families' voices and faces fit in easily, while others had to push and push just to be heard. It was what Samuel had always felt in his bones. Justice could feel like a closed club, more about keeping things running quietly than hunting out what was actually fair. As Judge Wallace pressed the point, his words built up walls of tradition. If the filings were not made by a certain date, if a form is missing the correct signature, these things matter, he insisted, barely glancing up at Elena or the lawyers from the council. It became clear he was fighting for more than the letter of the law. He was defending the authority of the system itself and maybe his own pride as a gatekeeper. It was less about whether Samuel's land truly belonged to him and more about keeping the old ways untouched right down to the final detail. The back and forth grew fierce. Elena pointed calmly to exceptions in the code, cases where rules had been bent for others. The lawyers beside her nodded, sometimes stepping forward themselves to clarify. Still, Judge Wallace resisted, growing more clipped and formal, even as the cracks in his certainty began to show. Around the room, people realized this hearing had turned into something much bigger than just property rights. The routine proceedings were gone, replaced by a struggle between stubborn power and a simple overdue claim to existence. With every exchange, it felt like the packed room in San Antonio's courthouse was holding its breath, waiting to see which would finally give way. Old rules or hard-won truth. Just as Judge Wallace looked set to dig in his heels and shut things down, something changed in the room that not even the old judge could have planned for. Behind the prosecution table sat Assistant District Attorney Lisa Turner, someone hardly anyone in San Antonio considered a risk-taker. Lisa was known for her carefulness, the kind of person who checked and double-checked her files and kept her opinions close. She rarely made waves and usually let Judge Wallace handle the high drama. But as the evidence piled up and Elena's steady voice broke through the tired routine, Lisa felt something shift inside her. For a long moment, Lisa just watched and listened. Her mind, usually clear and cool, raced through everything she had, seen and heard, not just today, but over the long course of similar cases. The facts laid out by Elena and the legal team left fewer and fewer places to hide behind procedure. More than that, Lisa saw something in Samuel's eyes, a kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting the same fight for years. Around her, murmurs started to ripple, and she could sense the unease in the room as folks realized that the usual outcome might not feel quite right this time. The turning point came quick. Maybe it was the look on the faces of the townspeople, watching from the wooden benches, or the knowledge that out there in the world beyond the courthouse, news could travel faster than ever with a single phone call or post. Maybe it was the fear that, if the wrong was not made right now, she would end up another name written into a story of injustice. Either way, Lisa knew she could not just sit still and let it happen. Lisa stood. Her chair scraped loud against the floor, and every head in the courtroom snapped up. Without hesitating, she walked over to Elena and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Your Honor, I believe it is time we acknowledge these documents. The evidence leaves little room for doubt, and in the interest of justice, I support the motion for Mr. Rodriguez's immediate release." The room went still, jaws dropping and whispers starting as folks tried to make sense of what they had just heard. Samuel, who had grown so used to waiting alone, suddenly found support from the very side that had seemed determined to keep him down. In that moment, the walls of old isolation cracked a little, letting in light from the most unexpected of corners. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of neighbors, friends, and folks from all around San Antonio had gathered in the summer heat, waiting on word of what was happening inside. Some leaned against cars, others fanned themselves beneath the shady live oaks, but all kept their eyes fixed on the building. There was an unspoken connection holding the group together, a knowledge that what happened in that stuffy courtroom was about more than just a piece of dirt or old paperwork. It was about dignity, about family, and about the stories that had been passed down quietly from parent to child after dinner or during church socials. Samuel, after years, under the weight of suspicion and struggle, felt the press of these memories as he sat in the courtroom. He thought of his father, who had walked those same fields, and his mother, whose recipes and songs still echoed through family reunions. Those pieces of history never left, not really, no matter how many season changes or hard times came. His own voice, shaky but full, finally caught the attention of the court as he told them what the land meant, not just in dollars and cents, but as the thread connecting generations of Rodriguez's. When he spoke, the words came out slow and careful, plain enough for everyone, lawyers and judges included, to hear the weight behind them. He explained how the land had given them more than a living, how it was the spot where families came together each Thanksgiving, and where neighborhood kids found shelter when someone's home was too crowded. For the black community watching outside, Samuel's words rang out like a bell, calling them to remember what had been taken and what still endured. His story was their story, a patchwork of pride stitched together by years of hard work and shared hope, sometimes bruised but always present. Inside the courthouse, even the silence seemed different. It was not just anxiety or habit anymore. It was a pause filled with respect, almost like the way folks bow their heads when someone says grace. The sense of tradition carried for years through humble gestures finally stood up tall in the light. The dreams Samuel's family had sung quietly to themselves at night were out in the open now, rising up to challenge all those old layers of forgetting that history tried to pile on. It was more than a victory or a loss. It was a reckoning, and it reached everyone in earshot. But even as Samuel spoke his truth and shared his memories, he could feel doubt drifting through the room like a stubborn Texas dust. With every honest word, he still noticed the sideways glances, the raised eyebrows among some of the court officials, and even a few in the community who had come to watch. It was as if, no matter how carefully he explained or how sincere his voice was, there was always one more hurdle, an invisible wall of suspicion that seemed to cling to people like him. At times, it felt that no personal history, no tearful story, could quite match the official stamp of a big organization or a letter from a powerful name downtown. Eleanor, who had worked alongside Samuel for months, had seen all of this before, and she was not surprised. She had known long ago they would need more than just heartfelt words to get through. She anticipated every challenge and had prepared mountains of extra evidence, leaving nothing to chance. As soon as she caught a glimpse of skepticism among the jurors or heard a hint of hesitation from Judge Wallace, she was ready. She reached for a separate folder packed with even more records, notarized deeds, property tax receipts signed year after year, and personal letters from officials who had visited the Rodriguez plot over the years. Elena did not just stop at paperwork. She called up character witnesses, neighbors who could tell stories of watching the family tend to the land through summers and hard winters, teachers who had taught 3 generations of Rodriguez children at Jefferson Elementary, even local business owners who remembered Samuel's father rallying neighbors to help after the big flood of 1987. Every time someone tried to discount Samuel's voice, she countered with another piece of proof, another voice who had seen up close what the Rodriguez family had given back to their community. These layers of evidence slowly left less and less room for resistance. The air changed as the truth grew impossible to deny, and Elena went about it all with a calm determination that said she had always expected it would take this much. She was gently, persistently dismantling the courtrooms, all defenses from inside brick by brick. Whether they admitted it or not, more and more people sitting in those wooden benches began to realize that this was not just about legal forms anymore. It was about acknowledging a story that had always been there, finally heard and believed. The time the sun was beginning to set over San Antonio, whispers about Samuel's hearing had already rolled through the city like a fast-moving storm. Social media feeds buzzed with clips taken outside the courthouse. Neighbors posted shaky cell phone videos of Samuel stepping out for a breath of air, or Eleanor calmly explaining the mind-boggling stack of documents she had submitted. Local radio hosts broke with their normal playlists to talk about what was going on, and hashtags carrying Samuel's name started popping up everywhere. As people shared stories, it became clear this was no longer just about one man and a disputed piece of land. Samuel's name, once only known in his little neighborhood, turned into a talking point for folks miles away and even far beyond the city. Across San Antonio, in beauty shops, barber shops, and church basements, people started to talk about Samuel as if they had always known him. His struggle carried something familiar: the grind of having to prove your worth, the endless battle just to hang on to what was already yours. The older folks, especially from the black community, watched the story unfold and felt pieces of their own lives reflected in it. They could still recall clear as day the times they had faced locked doors, skeptical officials, or sideways glances when simply asking for respect. The younger crowd got in on it too. High schoolers tweeted out support and made short videos, explaining in their own slang how unfair things had been. They drew posters, taped them outside the courthouse, and took selfies holding up banners that read, "Justice for Samuel." For once, people who normally kept their distance from courthouse drama felt like they had a good reason to come by, to support, or at least be seen. Inside the courtroom, Samuel felt all this attention in a way he never had before. He was still the same man who remembered every crack in the kitchen floorboards and the shape of the old oak outside his window. But he was no longer alone. It seemed as if the crowd outside, posting and cheering, was in there with him, challenging old doubts and giving courage where before there had mostly been worry. The hearing had stopped being just his fight. It was now a kind of stage for anyone. Whoever had to fight too hard for something simple and true. The walls of that old courthouse felt different, almost like they were listening for the first time in years. The celebration inside and outside the courthouse was impossible to ignore. Strangers shook Samuel's hand, and folks offered hugs, even some who had just learned his name that very day. It all moved fast, and in every direction, people acted as if a major wrong had finally been made right. The news cameras spun it as a victory. Elena's work was praised in speeches, and the cheers from the streets drifted past the dusty glass windows. But when he left the spotlight and returned home to his quiet kitchen, Samuel found himself sifting through a bittersweet sort of relief. He stared at the old table, one that had seen family birthdays, funerals, and those long nights spent arguing, quietly about money or the future. The paperwork was over, but a strange ache remained. His mind went back over everything. Was it really the truth that won, or just the fact that Elena was determined, organized, and respected by enough people to outlast the system? Would any other man, one without a family member who understood the rules inside out, have made it out of that courtroom whole? That doubt kept working its way into his thoughts, and when Eleanor came by, the tension between gratitude and unease filled the air. They sat together on the front porch, listening to the city wind down outside. Elena brought coffee, hoping to share the moment, but she could sense the cloud hanging over her father's head. After a while, Samuel put into words what troubled him. "You know, sweetheart," he said softly, "I'm not sure if the judge saw me for who I am, or if the law only budged because you were there fighting. There are folks out there, good people, who will never have someone like you on their side. What happens to them?" His voice caught, carrying the pain of old injustices and the guilt of surviving what so many did not. Elena placed her hand over his and let the silence stretch between them. She knew the question was not meant to accuse, but to mourn, to shine. A light on all the times the scales had tipped the wrong way for people without anyone powerful beside them. Around them, the house seemed to remember it all too. The names and stories that had faded quietly into history, never given a moment to speak or to be heard. Their victory did not erase that wound. It just made it clear that real justice, the kind that did not depend on luck or family, was still out of reach for so many. Elena heard every bit of Samuel's struggle, letting the weight of his words settle between them. For a few minutes, neither tried to fill the silence. The faint buzz of evening filled in the gaps, cicadas droning somewhere out in the yard. It was as if all of San Antonio's busy streets and honking cars faded away, leaving just the two of them sitting shoulder to shoulder, feeling their hearts working through the same ache. Eventually, Eleanor spoke, her voice softer than usual. She told Samuel what she had never really said out loud, not in any courtroom or in all her big closing arguments. "Dad," she began, "you see me out there fighting those battles and you think I'm strong. But everything I do, all the times I managed to stand up and speak, it's because I watched you keep going, year after year, no matter who was watching or judging. You." She shared how being a black woman in her line of work meant always feeling a little exposed, like fighting with two hands tied. People saw her successes and smiled, but did not really know the pushback, the second-guessing, or how she had been made to explain herself twice as much just to get a fair hearing. Even the victories, Elena admitted, felt complicated, never really hers alone, always shadowed by the pressure of representing her family, her neighborhood, even her whole community. But when she felt tired or doubted if it was ever worth it, she thought of Samuel. She pictured him steady at the table, letting everyone else talk first, but always holding to his truth. She remembered the long days when he picked himself up after each setback, how he never asked for thanks or recognition. She told him, tears in her eyes, any courage I found was born from watching you carry yourself. Your quiet strength gave me the roots I needed to push past the fear. If folks say I succeeded, it is only because you showed me how to try. Samuel, listening, let out a shaky breath, both proud and humbled. For the first time all day, the bitterness faded just a little. Around them dusk settled, cool and slow, and the hard questions about justice and luck stepped back long enough for love and respect to fill the space. As night fell over San Antonio, the echoes of Samuel and Elena's conversation seemed to ripple beyond their porch and out into the city. The news about Samuel's case did not just fade away. In fact, it kept growing, reaching places they never imagined. Stories about what had happened inside the courthouse were shared by word of mouth through church bulletins and across every social media platform locals used. It was not just Samuel's face that people remembered, but the old pain stretching back through decades of overlooked lives and silent stories. Moved by the attention and by their own memories, a group of elders from the East Side, some who had been marching since the civil rights era, some who simply remembered the way things used to be, gathered in the basement of Mount Zion Baptist Church. They were tired of being forgotten. In quiet voices, they came up with a plan to honor Samuel, but also to speak for everyone who never got their day in court. What started as a small idea grew fast, full of energy and hope. They wanted a silent march, one that would carry real weight. There were to be no shouted slogans, just the steady walking of shoes on the cracked sidewalks, a living testimony to generations who had worked, lost, and kept going anyway. Word spread even faster this time. Samuel heard about the march on one of Elena's group chats, surprised and humbled by how quickly his story had become part of something bigger. Local newspapers picked up the story, and several city council members called to ask what they could do. The younger folks on social media shared old photographs of the city, images of street corners where injustice was an open secret, and stories about family members who had faced similar battles. Plans for the march shifted from a handful of people to hundreds ready to join, all bound by a promise to walk in silence and demand not only better laws, but a better story. This growing movement made local leaders pay attention in a way they rarely did. No one could brush these voices aside anymore. The elders and everyone who joined them were not just demanding change. They were forcing the city to face the stories it had buried and to finally listen. The sidewalks became a new kind of stage, where the scars of the past were acknowledged with respect and where the possibility of real change felt, at last, within reach. On the morning of the march, the courthouse steps looked different. Instead of reporters crowding around for sound bites or lawyers hustling past, there was a quiet procession of elders making their way through the city's heart. Some leaned on canes, others held each other's arms, and a few carried small photos. Tucked into their jackets, snapshots of brothers, sisters, parents, all long gone or left behind by time and circumstance. They wore their Sunday best or whatever felt right, but what mattered most was the way they moved together, step after gentle step, toward the big wooden doors. Inside the courthouse, the usual chatter dropped to a hush as word spread that the elders from the East Side had arrived. Elena, helping Samuel to his seat, watched as the voices that had always been talked about but rarely heard began to fill the room just by being there. Where Samuel had once felt like just one man fighting for his family's story, now he could see a whole history lined up behind him, quietly refusing to disappear. The elders did not need to raise their voices. Their presence told everyone what speeches could not. Some eyes glistened, others stayed fixed on the floor, wrestling with old shame or regret. The power in the room shifted. pulled not by anger or demands, but by the certainty of people who had lost much yet come together simply to stand for what was right. City officials, some used to passing over such stories, now saw the faces they had missed for years. Even Judge Wallace, known for his steely reserve, fell silent for a long moment, studying each lined face and wrinkled hand. As the elders lined up along the courtroom wall, nobody rushed them. The march was slow, even inside, but it carried a gravity that rippled across the wooden benches. Those who doubted Samuel's story before could now see, without a single word, that his pain and struggle had never been about one family alone. The room became a witness, not just to his victory, but to the cracks in the larger story that needed fixing. What happened in those minutes brought new dignity to every person standing at the edge of that room. By the time the morning sun found its way through the tall windows, it was clear this was not just Samuel's fight. Everyone there saw that real change was possible because no one truly stands alone, not anymore. After the day of the march, things changed for Samuel in ways he never saw coming. Instead of the quiet days at home with familiar routines, he started getting phone calls and letters from people he had never met. Invitations came from schools that wanted him to tell his story to students who had only ever read about struggle. In textbooks, local associations and community organizers reached out too, asking if he would come and speak at their events. Even small groups in neighborhoods far from his own sent messages saying they had been following what happened and wanted to hear from him in person. At first, Samuel was not sure he was ready for so much attention. He had always been more comfortable listening to others than standing in front of a crowd. But Elena, now gently encouraging instead of defending, reminded him how powerful it could be for people to see someone like him, in the flesh, talking about the day everything changed. She helped him prepare, sometimes going over the same story together late into the night, working out the right words to say. Whenever Samuel walked into a new auditorium or community hall, he was welcomed like an old friend. He would see faces of all ages, but especially the young ones leaning forward in their seats, hungry for a connection to something real. He told them about the long road to justice, about patience, and how easy it is to feel invisible until folks stand behind you. Old men would squeeze his hand, tears in their eyes, and tell him he reminded them of their own fathers or uncles. Sometimes there were hugs that lasted a little too long, both parties hanging on to the feeling that healing was possible. In those moments, Samuel felt something shift inside. The ache and doubt he once carried began to fade with each conversation. The more he spoke, the more others joined in, sharing their own stories, each woven with hope and frustration, but lit up by the possibility of real change. His words were not just his anymore. They rippled out through the community, encouraging others to find their voice. All around San Antonio, it was as if a door had opened and people were finally ready to walk through. Neighborhoods buzzed with new conversations about rights, justice, and belonging. Samuel listened, smiled, and realized that his journey was feeding something bigger than himself, a movement carried by fresh voices determined to make their stories matter. While Samuel found new purpose in sharing his story, not everyone could escape the ripple effects that swept through San Antonio. Far from the community halls and hopeful gatherings, Judge Wallace, the same man who once seemed unshakable on his bench, now felt the ground shifting beneath him. For years, Judge Wallace had handed down decisions with little challenge, trusted by his peers and seldom called into question. He was used to being in control, with people addressing him in formal tones and hanging on his every word from that high wooden chair. But as Samuel's story spread, the mood in the courthouse changed. Staff no longer met Judge Wallace's eyes with the same open respect. Young attorneys in the halls sometimes lowered their voices when he passed by or shot each other wary glances. Community members who had once nodded politely on the street now crossed to the other side, leaving greetings unreturned. Editorials appeared in the local paper, questioning not just his recent ruling, but the whole system that had allowed so many voices to go unheard for so long. Every week, it seemed, a fresh wave of criticism rolled in, sometimes subtle, sometimes pointed, but never out of mind. Judge Wallace could not shake the feeling of being watched and, worse, measured in a way he was not used to. It gnawed at him late at night as he walked the quiet hallways of his home, searching the faces of old family photos for answers. He found himself replaying every detail: Elena's calm arguments, Samuel's unwavering patience, the silent march of elders flooding his courtroom. Over and over he wondered, had he ever been truly fair? Or had he only followed the path laid out by habit or pressure, never really opening himself to the stories behind the files stacked on his desk? The more he dwelled on it, the heavier the burden grew. Eventually, Judge Wallace saw that he could not go on pretending nothing had changed. He made the quiet decision to leave the bench for good, submitting his request for early retirement through a simple email. There were no speeches, no farewell parties, just an empty office and a career left behind like an ill-fitting suit. In the end, Judge Wallace stepped down with less ceremony than he ever imagined, finally facing the truth that had stubbornly waited for him all along. After the shock of Judge Wallace's quiet exit had settled, the city started to feel different. Samuel, with less weight on his shoulders, finally had time to notice small joys returning to his days. Meanwhile, Elena, who had always found energy in forward movement, saw that the bigger struggle was still ahead. She wanted something lasting to come out of all the change, a way to make sure what happened to Samuel would not just be another story people talked about and then let fade. Elena called her father one afternoon, her usual determination mixing with a sense of fresh hope. "Dad," she said, "I'm thinking about starting something new, something for all of us, not just a support group, but a real organization with resources and legal help. We could call it the San Antonio Alliance for Justice." She explained how this group could help others like Samuel navigate the endless paperwork, the unreturned phone calls, the cold doors of courthouses that too often kept working folks outside. "People need more than good intentions," she said. "They need a place to turn, somewhere to get real support when the system gets too big." Samuel, who had never pictured himself as a leader or activist, felt a wave of uncertainty. For years, he had just wanted peace and a little bit of dignity, but Elena's vision was hard to resist, especially when he considered how many friends and neighbors had faced the same struggles alone. He realized that joining Elena in this new effort was a chance to give back some of the support he had received. He said yes, a little hesitant, but realizing it was a vote for the future, not just for himself. They spent the next few weeks gathering others, neighbors who had been through the same legal limbo, younger people who wanted to learn more, even a couple of retired teachers who had watched generations of students leave the system wounded by its rules. Together, they turned Elena's idea into reality. The San Antonio Alliance for Justice took shape, meeting in local libraries, churches, and sometimes right in folks' living rooms. People who had felt ignored for years finally had a place to tell their stories, get advice, and see a path forward. Building this new group gave Samuel and Elena a reason to hope that real, lasting change was possible. For the first time, it felt like the doors were opening, not just for one family, but for everyone ready to walk through them. As the San Antonio Alliance for Justice began to take root, the community decided there was one more thing left to do. Word started to spread about a ceremony, nothing too formal, just a gathering at the old community center near the heart of town. Everyone called it Homecoming Day, a way to mark not just Samuel's journey, but the city's promise to finally stand by the stories it once pushed aside. When the day came, the air was heavy with summer warmth. Neighbors set up folding chairs outside, and a few local musicians played soft blues tunes on the porch. There was no stage, just a few tables covered with homemade cakes and pitchers of lemonade. Samuel arrived with Elena and was greeted by friends, supporters, and even a few faces he barely knew. Each handshake and embrace spoke of deep gratitude. Many remembered the pain Samuel had lived through, and now there was a quiet electricity, a sense that something good was finally settling into place. The crowd was made up of all sorts: elders from nearby communities, young activists, parents carrying curious toddlers, and church groups dressed in their Sunday best, even though it was a Saturday. People took turns sharing quick stories about Samuel's honesty, kindness, and the tough stretches he had weathered. Nothing in the event was polished, but that was what made it feel honest. Every speaker ended with the same message. This was not just about Samuel's win, it was about making sure everyone's dignity mattered. At last, the mayor stepped forward, carrying a small wooden plaque with a set of symbolic keys mounted on it. There was a hush, while she spoke not in the grand words you might hear at a big city gala, but in simple terms that everyone understood. Samuel, these keys stand for the right to belong. You have shown us the power of holding on to your truth, and today, San Antonio recognizes what was always yours. Samuel took the plaque, his hands shaking a little, and you could see the emotion in his eyes. People clapped, some cried, and the feeling of hope passed through the crowd like a breeze. The moment was small on its own, but as folks left and walked down familiar streets, they carried with them a sense that memory, belonging, and the right to be seen were now shared promises for everyone in the city. As the sun began to dip behind the rooftops of San Antonio, the memory of that simple ceremony lingered in everyone's mind. It was not just the gift of symbolic keys or the warm applause that stuck with people, but the sense that the city itself had shifted course. Where once the courthouse loomed large, a place thick with old anxieties and silent judgments, it no longer held the power it used to. Folks found themselves gathering more in the open-air markets, shaded plazas, and those familiar community halls that had always been spaces of togetherness. Samuel kept a quieter presence now. He did not need to stand at the center of every meeting or event, and rarely gave long speeches. Instead, people watched the way he moved, steady and open, whether helping set up folding chairs at a block party or listening patiently to someone sharing their own troubles. For many, Samuel became a kind of quiet reference point, proof that ordinary courage is often found not in shouting, but in how someone shows up day after day, treating others with decency and never letting go of hope. Over time, life in San Antonio began to feel more connected. The painful stories that had once been closed off behind thick walls came out into the open, giving way to practical changes. Neighbors helped each other navigate city offices. Parents organized workshops on tenants' rights, and students painted murals honoring community elders. The Alliance for Justice, started by Elena and Samuel, stayed busy but always welcomed new faces, making sure to carry forward the spirit of looking after each other. Samuel's name was spoken in many circles, not as a hero draped in grand words, but as someone whose story quietly invited others to imagine more doors opening across the city. His truth had not torn the system down in a blaze. It changed San Antonio by showing the real weight of lived experience, by turning pain into something useful and lasting. What Samuel left behind was not just paperwork or headlines, but an invitation, open to everyone, to keep pressing for justice in honest ways. As time rolled on, new voices stepped forward, drawing their own lessons from what Samuel started. Across the city, whether in bustling plazas or the hum of kitchen conversations, the call to fairness and dignity kept echoing. And in these spaces, the hope remained that justice would always find willing hands and open doors, ready to hold it up.